At the twilight of Imperial Russia, the Romanovs still stood as the most powerful and glittering dynasty in Europe. Yet behind the gilded walls of the Winter Palace, the Tsar's daughters lived quiet, sheltered lives, their world defined by duty, devotion, and the fragile innocence of youth. Their story, like that of their empire, was already standing at the edge of history. It is difficult to write anything pleasant, because there is very little of it here to report, but still God does not abandon us. The sun shines, and the birds sing. These words, written in a time of hardship, could well have reflected the tone of the years that lay ahead for the Romanov family. By the summer of 1914, the two eldest daughters of Emperor Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra had grown from playful children into young women. Olga was 18 and Tatiana 16. Their parents, ever mindful of royal duty, began to consider suitable marriages the ultimate obligation of imperial princesses.
Hold fast to your faith, for grace will see us through this darkness.
With their noble birth, delicate beauty, and impeccable upbringing, the sisters seemed destined for brilliant futures among Europe's crowned heads. Yet beneath their royal grace, both remained innocent and unworldly, far removed from the confident, politically trained princes they were expected to charm. Since childhood, Olga and Tatiana had spent their happiest days aboard the imperial yacht Standard, surrounded by officers and sailors who treated them with kindness and respect. Their fondness for these familiar figures had always been harmless, a reflection of affection rather than desire for a match outside their rank was unthinkable in the rigid order of the court. When the search for suitable husbands began in earnest, it became clear that neither girl possessed the practiced elegance or social ease required in diplomatic society. They were modest, sincere, and still childlike, more accustomed to family prayers and simple pastimes than to the intrigues of royal courts. That summer, just before the storm of war broke over Europe, Emperor Nicholas and Empress Alexandra believed they had found a promising suitor for Olga Prince Carol, heir to the throne of Romania. Yet their eldest daughter remained unmoved. Her quiet resolve would soon make it clear that her heart could not be commanded by dynastic expectation alone. Olga was deeply unsettled when the prospect of marriage to Prince Carol of Romania was raised. His reputation as a frivolous admirer of women was widely known, and the idea of uniting with such a man filled her with quiet dismay. She made her feelings clear. She wished no part in the match. Beyond personal distaste, Olga could not bear the thought of leaving her homeland. The notion of living abroad, far from Russia and all that was familiar, was impossible for her to accept. In June of 1914, the Romanov family traveled to meet their Romanian relatives. The visit was carefully arranged, providing Prince Carol a chance to prove himself worthy of the Tsar's eldest daughter. Yet from the outset, Olga's heart was firmly closed to persuasion. During the official family photograph, Olga positioned herself at the far right of the frame, maintaining a polite but deliberate distance from Prince Carol, who stood behind her. Her attention rested entirely on the infant seated upon her knee, as though to make plain her indifference. Anticipating that further gestures of charm might follow, the sisters devised a quiet act of rebellion. Before departing for Romania, they spent long hours in the sun, deliberately allowing their skin to tan and redden. Upon arrival, Their appearance caused visible discomfort among their hosts. For royal ladies, to display sunburn was considered improper, a sign of rustic carelessness rather than refinement. Yet for the Romanov sisters, this was precisely the point. Their plan had succeeded. None appeared in the least alluring to Prince Carol, and the prospect of any engagement quietly dissolved. In truth, Olga and her sisters saw no urgency in the matter of marriage. Life within their family circle, sheltered and affectionate, still seemed far more precious than the uncertain promises of royal alliances.
Yet only weeks after the family's return to Russia, all thoughts of courtship and royal alliances vanished. The peaceful rhythm of their days was broken. On the 19th of July, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, and the empire was drawn into the great conflict that would consume Europe. The following day, Emperor Nicholas and Empress Alexandra appeared before the people on the balcony of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. A vast crowd filled the square below, their voices rising together in the imperial anthem, God Save the Tsar. For a brief moment, unity and devotion seemed unshakable. But the early months of the war tested that devotion cruelly. Within the first 5 days of battle, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed or wounded. The cost of patriotism was counted in human lives, and its burden fell heavily across the empire.
To meet the suffering, women from every corner of Europe volunteered to serve as Red Cross nurses. Among them were Empress Alexandra and her 2 eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, who resolved to work not in ceremony but in truth. Their duties were far from symbolic. The sisters faced the full reality of war, shattered limbs, torn flesh, and the cries of the wounded. Within weeks, they were standing in operating rooms, witnessing amputations and tending to the broken bodies of men who had once stood proudly in uniform. At Tsarskoye Selo, a hospital was established near the Alexandra Palace, where Olga and Tatiana devoted themselves to caring for injured officers. Though the distance between palace and ward was short, it marked the passage into a world entirely different from their own, one of blood, pain, and endurance. For the first time, the sheltered daughters of the Tsar came face to face with human suffering. The experience stripped away the illusions of privilege and gave them an intimate understanding of lives lived far from the glitter of court. One afternoon, a carriage was sent to collect Olga and Tatiana from the hospital, but by chance, their lady-in-waiting was not with them. Left to themselves, the sisters made a spontaneous decision. Instead of returning directly to the palace, they asked the driver to take them into town so they could visit a shop, a small taste of ordinary life. Inside, they quickly discovered how unprepared they were. Surrounded by shelves and counters, they realized they did not actually know how to make a purchase. Embarrassed yet amused, they returned the next day and asked one of the senior nurses how ordinary people went about shopping. The nurse, kindly and patient, explained every step to them. The war, for all its tragedy, brought the sisters into contact with a world far removed from the seclusion of royal life. In the hospital wards, they spoke with wounded officers, listening to their stories of travel, hardship, and home. These conversations opened a door to what they called the outside life, a realm that fascinated all 5 Romanov children. Even their young brother, Alexei, when he visited, was full of eager questions about this wider world beyond the palace gates.
Yet, as the war broadened their horizons, it also placed strain upon the deep closeness of their family. Emperor Nicholas was frequently at the front, and the distance weighed heavily on Empress Alexandra. Their separation was softened only by their letters, tender, constant, and filled with affection. They wrote to each other several times a day, their words preserving the intimacy that had marked their marriage since its beginning. Through the long months of conflict, their correspondence revealed a love unwavering and profound, proof that even in the darkest of times, their devotion to one another endured unbroken. By the summer of 1915, the tide of war had turned against Russia. The army was in retreat, and the scale of loss was staggering, nearly 1.5 million soldiers killed or wounded. Morale within the ranks had fallen to desperate lows. In an attempt to restore order and unity, Emperor Nicholas made a fateful decision. He dismissed his uncle, the experienced Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, from the post of commander-in-chief and assumed personal command of the army. From that moment, the Tsar himself would direct military operations from the front lines. With Nicholas now away from St. Petersburg, Empress Alexandra remained at the Alexander Palace, entrusted with overseeing internal affairs and the welfare of the empire. Her new responsibilities, coupled with the lingering presence of Grigory Rasputin in the capital, soon gave rise to suspicion. Rumors spread rapidly through society, whispering that Alexandra and Rasputin were manipulating state affairs behind closed doors, that together they were the hidden force guiding the empire toward disaster.
It's a tragedy, but perhaps necessary for the empire.
For Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, their nursing duties became both duty and refuge. The hospital wards offered escape from the tense and stifling atmosphere that now pervaded the palace. There, amid rows of wounded soldiers, the sisters found purpose and companionship. Their private photographs from those years captured the tenderness of those connections, smiling beside patients, reading letters aloud, or sitting quietly by hospital beds. The wards had become a second home to them. As the war dragged on, and the wounded arrived in ever greater numbers, the sisters worked late into the night, changing dressings, making beds, sterilizing silk for sutures, and preparing swabs. When the day's duties ended and they returned briefly to the palace for a meal, they often came back to the hospital afterward, bringing photographs to share and moments of comfort for their favorite patients. Even when their shifts ended and they returned to the Alexander Palace, Olga and Tatiana often telephoned the hospital to check on their favorite patients, exchanging a few last words before nightfall. The bond between the sisters and the men they cared for had grown unexpectedly deep. In the many photographs taken during those years, Olga and Tatiana were often seen beside dark-haired officers with striking features, men from the southern regions of the empire, especially Armenia and Georgia. These soldiers, with their proud bearing and bold mustaches, carried an air of mystery and warmth that seemed to captivate the young Grand Duchesses far more than the reserved northern officers of their own court. In May of 1915, a wounded Georgian officer named Dmitry Shagbagov was brought to the hospital at Tsarskoye Selo. Gentle, modest, and kind, Dmitry soon caught Olga's attention, and a quiet affection blossomed between them. Their friendship, born amid the suffering of war, offered her a brief glimpse of happiness. But the reality of duty and conflict soon intervened. Once Dmitri recovered, he was sent back to the front. The separation pained Olga deeply. Later that year, fate brought him back once more gravely wounded for the second time. When Olga saw him again, her spirit lifted, and she spent every moment she could at his bedside, offering comfort and care. It was a tender bond, unspoken and unfulfilled. In her heart, Olga longed for a simple life far from court, to marry a man like Dmitri, to live quietly in the countryside, away from royal obligations. Yet such dreams could never be granted to a Grand Duchess of Russia. Her path had been written long before she could choose it. The loss of that fragile hope deepened the melancholy that already shadowed her days. During the harshest years of the war, Olga suffered recurring spells of exhaustion and sadness so severe that physicians prescribed treatments common at the time, a strict rest regimen, and a course of arsenic injections. At the beginning of 1916, Dmitri Shagbagov left the hospital to return to active service. Olga watched him go, unaware that it would be the last time she ever saw him. Though their connection had been brief, it left an indelible mark on her heart. In the months that followed, Olga clung to any scrap of information about him. When she later met Dmitri's mother, she felt an almost childlike joy, saying softly that it was as though she now possessed a small piece of him. Even in her diary of early 1917, she noted his birthday with quiet devotion. For Olga, his memory remained a light she never allowed to fade.
Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the palace, scandal and suspicion gathered like a storm. The close association between Empress Alexandra and Grigory Rasputin had become a source of constant controversy. Whispered tales of impropriety spread through high society, each rumor more damaging than the last. The gossip reached fever pitch. Many accused Alexandra not only of moral corruption, but of treachery itself. Her German birth became a weapon against her, as claims circulated that she and Rasputin were conspiring to betray Russia, seeking peace with Germany and abandoning the Allies. In such a climate of fear and instability, truth mattered less than belief. The empire stood on the brink of revolution, and in that chaos, perception became reality. Even foreign diplomats, Sir George Buchanan of Britain and Maurice Paléologue of France, repeated the stories to their governments as fact. The rumors, fed by fear and resentment, took on a dangerous life of their own. They eroded confidence in the monarchy, casting the imperial family as symbols of decay and deceit. On the 16th of December, 1916, a group of Romanov relatives and disillusioned nobles decided that Rasputin's influence had to be ended. That night, they made their move, an act they believed would save the dynasty, but which, instead, marked the beginning of its end.
On that cold December evening, Grigory Rasputin vanished, without trace, in Petrograd. The following day, Anastasia recorded her unease in her diary. Father Gregory went missing last night. They are searching for him everywhere. It is dreadful. The uncertainty filled the palace with fear. That night, the four sisters, shaken and tearful, slept together in a single bed for comfort. Two days later, the news reached them. Rasputin was dead. The horror of it swept through the family. Yet among the sisters, it was Olga who understood that his death, however shocking, might ultimately bring a measure of peace. She alone seemed aware of the political consequences that had been gathering for months. Olga had long sensed that Rasputin's presence around her mother had grown into something dark and unhealthy, a source of influence that clouded judgment and fed resentment throughout the empire. Though she believed the act itself was cruel and unjust, she also recognized that it might have been inevitable. The manner of Rasputin's death horrified her most. He had been shot and then beaten to death in the cellar of the Moika Palace, the grand residence of Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of Russia's greatest fortunes. The brutality of the act was appalling enough, but its intimacy struck even deeper. The killers were not strangers to the imperial family. Felix Yusupov was married to the Tsar's only niece, and his accomplice, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, had once been close to the Romanovs, even spoken of as a possible husband for Olga herself. To Nicholas and Alexandra, their participation felt like betrayal of the most personal kind.
Within the broader Romanov circle, many viewed the murder as the beginning of a greater plan, not simply to remove Rasputin, but to rid the empire of Empress Alexandra's influence altogether. For them, his death was to have been the first step in a quiet coup, but instead of saving the dynasty, it exposed how divided and fragile the Imperial House had already become. The conspiracy against Rasputin had been conceived as part of a wider effort, a means not only to remove him, but to silence Empress Alexandra as well. Among the disillusioned nobles, a plan was discussed to abduct her and confine her to a convent, thereby freeing the emperor from her influence. They believed that once Alexandra was removed from affairs of state, Nicholas would finally rule with clear purpose and strength. Even the Tsar's own mother, Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, shared these fears. From her residence in Kiev, she lamented in a letter, "If only the Lord would open poor Nicky's eyes, and he would cease following her dreadful counsel. What despair! All of this will end in disaster." But Rasputin's assassination did not heal the divisions within the imperial family. It deepened them. By January of 1917, Nicholas and Alexandra stood isolated, estranged from their relatives, and increasingly distrusted by the political elite. In February, as Nicholas remained at military headquarters, news reached him of riots and food shortages in Petrograd. The demonstrations, at first small, grew rapidly as soldiers refused orders to suppress the crowds and instead joined them. Within days, the garrison mutinied, and what began as unrest turned into revolution.
At the Alexandra Palace, the Empress stayed with her children, who lay ill with measles. Only Maria was spared. From their sick rooms, the four sisters heard the sounds of distant gunfire and the strains of La Marseillaise drifting from the soldiers' barracks, a haunting signal that power was slipping away. Empress Alexandra tried to shield her children from the truth for as long as she could, but the upheaval outside soon made silence impossible. The empire was collapsing around them. As Petrograd fell into chaos, the Tsar's advisors, generals, and members of the Duma concluded that only his abdication could prevent total disaster. On the 2nd of March, 1917, Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, signed the decree relinquishing the throne for himself and for his son, Alexei. With that single act, more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule came to an end. At first, only Maria was told the news of her father's abdication. The others were still confined to their beds, weak from illness. Outwardly, Maria seemed calm, but later one of the ladies-in-waiting found her crouched in a corner, quietly weeping. She confessed that she feared the revolutionaries would come and take her mother away. Nearly a week passed before Empress Alexandra gathered enough strength to tell the remaining children the truth. The moment was heavy with disbelief. Young Alexei, puzzled and pale, asked the simple yet piercing question: if there isn't a Tsar, who is going to govern Russia? No one in the room could give him an answer.
On the 9th of March, Nicholas returned home. No longer Tsar, he was addressed as Colonel Romanov. The Alexandra Palace, once the family's refuge, had become their confinement. The provisional government had placed them under strict house arrest. They were forbidden to leave the grounds, to receive visitors, or to send private messages. Their letters were opened and examined for secret writing. Even the telephone and telegraph were taken away. The world beyond the palace gates had vanished from their lives. For the children, the change was a brutal awakening. The servants who once bowed to them now spoke with open authority. Derevenko, the sailor who had long served as Alexei's attendant, began ordering him about, speaking to him as to a child of no rank. The sense of captivity grew daily. Under armed guard, the family was permitted brief walks in a small section of the Alexander Park. A single bridge marked the boundary they could not cross. Beyond it stood crowds of townspeople, pressing against the gates for a glimpse of the fallen Romanovs. Their misfortune had become a public spectacle. In the first days after the revolution, King George V of Britain had offered his cousin Nicholas and his family safe refuge. But fate intervened. The children's measles made travel impossible. Both the British and the provisional government hesitated. Had they acted swiftly, the Romanovs might have been taken north to Murmansk, and from there, under neutral escort, to England. By the time the children recovered, the offer had been withdrawn. Political caution outweighed family loyalty, and the window of escape had closed. The imperial family was left stranded in their own homeland, uncertain of what awaited them. Within the walls of the Alexander Palace, Empress Alexandra grew increasingly despondent. Ill health and isolation deepened her melancholy, while outside, the empire she had once ruled continued to crumble beyond her reach.
After their illness, the girls' hair began to fall out in clumps, a lingering effect of the measles. One by one, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia had their heads shaved, while young Alexei insisted on doing the same in solidarity with his sisters. A photograph was later taken of them smiling bravely, their bare heads uncovered. When Empress Alexandra saw it, she was horrified. To her eyes, they looked not like children in recovery, but like prisoners awaiting execution. Nearly 5 months after their confinement began, on the 1st of August, the family was ordered to leave the Alexander Palace. Their departure was quiet and subdued. At the Alexandrovsky station, they boarded a guarded train, unaware of where it would take them. The only instruction given was to prepare for a long journey east and to pack warm clothing. For the children, it was their first true glimpse of Russia beyond the narrow world of court and capital. As the train moved steadily eastward, they watched vast plains unfold into endless forests and wide, empty skies. The empire their father had once ruled seemed boundless, yet distant, almost foreign to them. Anastasia later described the journey in a short letter to her English tutor, Sydney Gibbs, written in her charmingly broken English. The first day was hot and very dusty. At the stations, we had to close the window curtains that nobody should see us. On the way, many funny things happened. If I have time, I shall write to you. I travel further on. Goodbye. Do not forget me.
Her farewell carried a quiet truth. The family's final destination, Tobolsk, had been chosen precisely for its isolation. Situated some 1,700 miles east of St. Petersburg, it was a remote provincial town, largely forgotten by the modern world. Tobolsk had been bypassed by the Trans-Siberian Railway and could be reached only by riverboat. In winter, when the river froze solid, it became completely cut off, a prison of ice and silence. For the fallen imperial family, this exile promised neither danger nor rescue, only obscurity. Their assigned residence was the governor's house, considered one of the finest in Tobolsk. Yet for Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children, it marked not comfort but the quiet beginning of an uncertain captivity at the farthest edge of the empire that had once bowed before them. When officials arrived in Tobolsk ahead of the family to inspect their new residence, they found the governor's house in a pitiful state. The rooms were bare, the air thick with damp and neglect, and much of the furniture had been stripped away. It was a far cry from the comfort of the Alexandra Palace. Their new quarters offered only a small kitchen garden and a modest yard, both enclosed and constantly watched. The confinement weighed heavily on them, especially on Nicholas, who filled the long days with small routines, pacing the yard again and again, sometimes 40 or 50 times in an hour, or exercising on a makeshift horizontal bar fixed to a tree. Fresh air became a rare luxury. In one set of photographs from that time, the family is seen sitting on the glass roof of a greenhouse, their faces turned toward the sun. It was the only place they could sit outdoors, unguarded, a fragile imitation of freedom within their walled captivity.
On the 6th of September, Anastasia wrote a letter to her dear friend Vera, filled with the innocence and warmth of a girl trying to remain cheerful. Thank you so much, my darling Vera, for the letter. I am not sending photo cards, as they might get lost on the way. We remember our cozy infirmary very often. Do you still go there? We are all healthy. Everyone thanks you for your greetings and sends theirs in return. We have settled cozily, and the view is rather pretty. The weather, luckily, is hot and sunny almost every day. I apologize for my terrible handwriting. I have just come back from the little garden, where we played, and now my hands are shaking. We made a swing ourselves, and we use it a lot. We also have chickens, ducks, and a little pig that eats plenty of rotten cabbage. How are Nina and her sister? Give them our regards. Kiss Katya and tell her that we think about her a lot. I am writing on the balcony, and the sun is warming me. Regards to all who remember us. All the best, darling. I kiss you firmly. Anastasia. At the end of the same letter, Maria added her own gentle note. We congratulate you warmly, dear Vera, on your birthday. From all our hearts, we wish you happiness and good health. I was happy to hear from you. Thank your sister for her greetings. It must be nice for you to work and ride together with her now. Did you receive our letter before our departure? What are you doing these days? I kiss you and Lily very firmly. All the best. Maria. The letters from Tobolsk revealed both the sisters' innocence and their courage. Even as prisoners, they wrote of sunlight, swings, and friendship, finding in the smallest comforts a way to keep their spirits alive, unaware that the world outside their quiet exile was already moving beyond the reach of mercy. The governor's house in Tobolsk was small and overcrowded. The four sisters shared a single bedroom, which they transformed into a tiny shrine to their lost world. The walls were covered with religious icons, family photographs, and portraits of the wounded officers they had once cared for. These small tokens of memory gave their confinement a trace of warmth. Outside, their windows stretched a landscape both harsh and new. What little they saw of Siberia astonished them: vast skies, endless plains, and people so unlike those of the capital. Their captors often remarked on the sisters' innocence. The local commissar was taken aback by their surprise at seeing Yakut traders and other indigenous people walking through the streets in reindeer skins. The sisters would gather at the window, watching with wide-eyed curiosity, as if gazing upon visitors from another world. In letters home, they wrote of how much joy they found in simply watching the streets below waving to passers-by, observing sledges and horses, or noting the small changes of the seasons. Even through the frozen panes of glass, it was their one fragile connection to life beyond their confinement. On the 18th of September, Tatiana wrote to her godmother, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, describing the monotony of their days, with a grace that masked the depth of their isolation. It is fun to sit and watch the street, to see people walk by. That is our only amusement. From our windows we have a beautiful view of the mountains and the upper part of the town, where there is a large cathedral. We play a game, something like tennis, though without a net, just for practice. Then we walk back and forth so as not to forget how to walk. On Sundays we have a service in the hall. We went to church twice. You can imagine what joy it was after 6 months. I will wait for letters from you. All the best. May the Lord bless you all. We kiss you very affectionately. We pray for you. Your very loving goddaughter, Tatiana.
As winter descended on Tobolsk, the world outside turned to ice and silence. By mid-December, the temperature had fallen below -20. The family tried to keep themselves occupied chopping wood, pulling young Alexei on his sledge, or sweeping the snow from the small yard.
Indoors, the cold crept through every wall, Anastasia wrote, in frustration that their hands were too stiff to write properly, yet she and her sisters continued to send letters whenever they could. Though they had little new to say, writing allowed them to feel connected, to believe, for a moment, that the world beyond their prison still remembered them. On the 10th of December, Maria wrote a letter to a close friend, her words gentle yet shadowed with longing. The other day it was very cold. You must still have warm weather? I am so envious that you can look at the wonderful sea. This morning, at 8, we went to liturgy. We are always so happy when they allow us to go to church. Of course, one cannot compare this little church with our cathedral at Tsarskoye Selo, but still, it is better than praying in the rooms. Right now, we are all sitting together. My sisters are also writing. The dogs are running about and begging to sit on our laps. I often remember Tsarskoye Selo and our merry concerts at the infirmary. Do you remember how much fun it was when the wounded used to dance? It all seems so long ago, does it not? Well, it is time for me to end. I wish you all the best and kiss you affectionately. Heartfelt regards to all your family. Maria.
Beyond the quiet world of Tobolsk, Russia itself had been transformed. At the end of October, the provisional government collapsed under the force of a Bolshevik uprising led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. In a single stroke, the imperial family's last remaining protection vanished, and their fate passed into the hands of those who despised all they represented.
Among the sisters, it was Olga who felt the weight of these changes most deeply. Naturally reflective and often melancholic, she grieved not only for her family's loss, but for the suffering of her country. She could not comprehend how Russia had turned against her father, whom she had always seen as gentle and dutiful. In their letters and diaries, all four sisters hinted at a quiet dread, an unspoken awareness that something terrible was drawing near. The isolation of Tobolsk, once a shield, now felt like a warning.
On the 3rd of March, 1918, the new Bolshevik government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending Russia's war with Germany. Yet, Peace on paper brought no peace in reality. Even as one war closed, another, the civil war for Russia's future, had begun, and the Romanovs found themselves caught in its dark center. Russia soon descended into chaos. The nation was torn apart by civil war, pitting the Bolshevik Red Army against the anti-communist White forces. As the fighting spread, the new rulers in Moscow grew fearful that their enemies might attempt to free the former Tsar and rally around him. The Romanovs, they decided, would have to be moved to a place of greater security. But young Alexei, frail and suffering from another attack of illness, was too weak to endure the journey. It was therefore arranged that he would remain in Tobolsk with his sisters Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia, while Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria were sent ahead under guard. For the family, separation, the fate they had dreaded most, had at last come to pass.
On the morning of the 26th of April, the moment of parting arrived. The sisters wept openly as their parents and Maria prepared to leave. There was no promise of reunion, no assurance that they would ever see one another again. Yet, in their grief, they clung to their faith, praying that divine will would one day bring them together once more.
Nicholas and Alexandra believed they were being taken to Moscow, the new Bolshevik capital, where they might at least remain together under supervision. Instead, the train carried them 1,000 miles eastward to the industrial city of Ekaterinburg, a place that would soon become synonymous with the family's tragic fate.
In Tobolsk, the remaining children faced their first Easter without their parents. It would also be their last. Determined to observe the holy day with dignity, the sisters and their attendants decorated a small icon corner in the parlor with flowers and fir branches. That night, a local priest came to celebrate the midnight liturgy for the small household of prisoners. The soft chants of the Easter service echoed through the dimly lit rooms, a faint echo of the grand ceremonies they had once attended at Tsarskoe Selo. But the absence of their parents and the silence of news from Ekaterinburg weighed heavily upon them. Pierre Gilliard, their devoted tutor, recorded the mood in his diary. Saturday, May 4th, a sad Easter Eve. We are in low spirits. The joy of the resurrection, once the brightest day of their year, had faded into the quiet sorrow of separation and uncertainty. Though no word had come from their parents, the sisters refused to give up hope. They began writing letters in secret, trusting that perhaps one or two might reach Ekaterinburg through the sympathy of a guard. Each letter was written with tenderness and restraint, a quiet act of faith amid uncertainty. On the 5th of May, Olga wrote to her parents with a mixture of devotion and longing. Dear beloved ones, we would so love to know how you celebrated your Easter. Dear Mama, when will we finally be together? May God look after you. The midnight service and the liturgy afterwards were beautifully done. It was quiet and intimate. We lit all the sidelights except for the chandelier, and there was enough light. The little one slept through the service and did not join in the Easter supper, and did not even notice when we moved him to his bed. The candles with the golden stripes were so lovely. We lit them in turns for you during the service. Mama, my little soul, how are you? I feel so sad when I think of you. Dear beloved Mama, how I long to see you and kiss you.
While the children in Tobolsk clung to hope, their parents and sister Maria had arrived in Ekaterinburg, confined in a building grimly named by the Bolsheviks the House of Special Purpose. What had once been mere house arrest was now unmistakably imprisonment. The residence, surrounded by tall wooden fences topped with barbed wire, was guarded day and night by armed sentries. Every movement of the captives was watched. Even the smallest act, walking to the lavatory, opening a window, or speaking with one another, was done under supervision. The atmosphere inside the house was tense and oppressive. Nicholas and Alexandra could sense that something fundamental had changed. The guards no longer pretended courtesy, and the silence that hung over the room seemed filled with foreboding. They knew their story was moving toward an end, one that would not be merciful. In Tobolsk, the remaining sisters at least had the comfort of light and a view of the streets beyond. But in Ekaterinburg, even that small solace was denied. Heavy curtains were nailed across the windows, shutting out the world entirely. The family that had once ruled Russia now lived in near darkness, cut off from the empire, from hope, and from one another. When at last the children in Tobolsk began receiving letters from Ekaterinburg, the words that reached them were bleak. The tone was careful but unmistakably grim, each page revealing glimpses of a life that had grown harsher by the day.
In one letter, Maria described the oppressive conditions with a calm that barely concealed her distress. "We miss the quiet and peaceful life in Tobolsk. Here we have unpleasant surprises almost daily. Just now, members of the regional committee came and asked each of us how much money we had with us. We had to sign off on it. Who would have thought that after 14 months of captivity they would treat us this way? I write to you in semi-darkness, as we have no light because the windows have been whitewashed. The white color is very unpleasant. It is worst for Mama, who constantly suffers from headaches. The monotony of confinement, the constant inspections, and the dim, shuttered rooms began to erode the family's spirits. Yet in these most difficult hours, they turned inward and found strength in the one thing that could not be taken from them, their faith. Prayer became both refuge and rhythm, the only structure left to their days. In another letter, written to her young brother Alexei, Maria's words reflected this quiet endurance and the grace with which they bore their suffering. It is difficult to write anything pleasant because there is very little of it here to report, but on the other hand, God does not abandon us. The sun shines and the birds sing. This morning we heard the church bells. That was the only pleasant and agreeable event. My dear, how I would love to see you. I hope you feel better quickly and start running around again. I hold you very tightly in my arms, my dear little brother. May Christ protect you, your Masha. Her letter echoed with the same faith that had sustained them since the war, a simple belief that even amid despair, God had not turned away. In the silence of their captivity, the Romanovs clung to that light, fragile yet unbroken, as the darkness around them deepened. On the 20th of May, Alexei and his three sisters, Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia, were finally ordered to leave Tobolsk and join their parents in Ekaterinburg. They traveled by riverboat down the Irtish, escorted by armed guards. During the voyage, their English tutor, Sidney Gibbs, quietly took a few final photographs, the last known images of the children alive. Among the attendants who accompanied them was one of the family's loyal ladies in waiting. She later recalled how deeply Olga had changed. Once a radiant young woman of 22, she now appeared weary and withdrawn, her spirit dimmed by months of sorrow and confinement. On the 23rd of May, the family was reunited in the House of Special Purpose. The joy of seeing one another again was shadowed by an unspoken dread. All of them felt that their story was nearing its end.
From that moment, contact with the outside world ceased entirely. The guards were forbidden to speak to the prisoners, and the slightest exchange of words was punished. Most of the sentries drawn from the ranks of rough peasants and hardened soldiers, were filled with revolutionary fervor. Many took pleasure in demonstrating their new authority over those who had once ruled them. Years later, one of the guards confessed to the cruelty of that time. It is shameful to admit it, but all of us, to the last man, were guilty toward those unfortunates. It was difficult for these young, coarse peasants, suddenly elevated to the role of guards, to restrain themselves even in thought from the temptation to satisfy their basest instincts. They mocked the defenseless girls, watching their every move. I often pitied them. When they played a little dance on the piano, they smiled, but tears would fall from their eyes onto the keys. Some guards filled their idle hours by scrawling vile words and crude drawings on the walls of corridors and lavatories. They did so deliberately where the prisoners could not avoid seeing them. What gave them the greatest satisfaction was to ask the girls, with a sneer, whether they had noticed.
In this atmosphere of humiliation and fear, the Romanov sisters endured with quiet dignity. They clung to one another, maintaining the small courtesies of family life, even as the world around them sank further into darkness. The worst indignities within the House of Special Purpose came from the guards stationed in the corridors outside the family's private rooms. One of the household servants, later released because of illness, described their behavior with quiet horror. When one of the young Grand Duchesses went to the bathroom, the guard would call after her, asking where she was going and why. When she went inside, he would stand facing the door, waiting for her to come out again. On another occasion, it was Maria who faced down two of the coarser guards. When they taunted her with vulgar jokes, she met their eyes and said firmly, "How can you stomach repeating such shameful words? Be polite and decent men." Her rebuke silenced them instantly.
Inside the house, time moved slowly. No news entered, and none was allowed to leave. Letters, newspapers, and even rumors were forbidden. The Romanovs lived in complete isolation, waiting without knowing what they waited for. Outside those whitewashed walls, however, the Bolshevik leadership in Moscow debated what was to be done with the imperial family. As the civil war tightened around Ekaterinburg, the local authorities resolved to act.
In the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918, the long captivity of the Romanovs came to its end. The four sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia were taken with their parents and brother into a small cellar room. There, they were shot at close range, and those who survived the first volley were finished with bayonets. Their bodies were carried into the forest, cast into an abandoned mineshaft, and covered with acid and lime in an attempt to erase every trace. When they died, Olga was 22, Tatiana 21, Maria 19, and Anastasia 17. Today, the four sisters are remembered as victims of a violent age and honored as holy martyrs by the Orthodox Church. Their faith, serenity, and dignity in the face of suffering endure as a final testament to the lost grace of a fallen dynasty.